And to begin our afternoon program, we'd like to welcome the curator, art historian, and critic, Mark Godfrey.
Hello, everyone. I would like to start by thanking so much Musa and Mark, Philip and Anders for the exhibition and for organising this symposium, and everyone else who's been working on the slides and so on. My talk is simply called Gustin's Legs. And it's been so long since I gave a talk in public that before I didn't need reading glasses, but now I do. In March 1977, Gustin opened his third show at the David McKee Gallery in New York, devoted to the paintings he'd made in 1976. It had been an extremely prolific year, and when McKee visited Gustin up in Woodstock to plan the show, they'd taken the decision to split it into two parts so as to be able to exhibit two sets of paintings. The first part had 9 canvases featuring legs, shoes, and soles. There were at least a dozen other leg paintings that Gustin and McKee would have gone through in the studio. There was no space to show them in the show. If we look at the checklist, we can see that among the 9 paintings, there are works that are now in the collections of the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., Tate in London, the National Gallery of Australia, the National Gallery of Canada, the Denver Art Museum, and the Art Institute of Chicago. And the remaining 3 are privately owned. The list of institutional holdings makes it seem that part 1 of the 1977 show was an incredible success, but the works only entered the museums after Gustin's death by a gift or purchase, and in fact, at the time, it would have appeared to the artist, and I guess McKee, that the exhibition was a total failure. There were neither reviews of consequence nor critical responses until Roberta Smith penned a beautiful text in Art in America almost a year later. And just yesterday, she penned another one, so thank you. There was no museum interest, no sales at all. Gustin was so disillusioned by the failure of the show that he decided temporarily to leave the gallery and stop exhibiting his art in New York. For a while, he had a plan to hire buses every year to bring interested people to Woodstock to see what he'd been doing that year. Gustin was used to his art being ignored in the 1970s, but the silence that met the 1977 show must have been all the more painful because of the imagery in these paintings. The piles and stacks of limbs, the shoes, the pits filled with bodies, and the crematorium flames had a very particular resonance for him, as we'll see. But first, we need to understand the history of legs and shoes in his work by this time. Gustin had been drawing legs in odd positions since he was a boy. One of the first published cartoons in the LA Times shows someone falling backwards, knees bent, soles facing forward. He was fascinated by the absurdly elongated and twisted bodies drawn by cartoonists that he loved, but by the 1940s he had to confront the fact that the dismemberments comically depicted in the funnies pre-echoed the photographs that started to arrive in the United States following the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps. Seeing the images of the camps, in other words, changed his own relationship with cartoons. The photographs tarnished childhood pleasures. Gustin first responded to the images of the camps in 1946-7 in the Porch paintings. He later told Dorrie Ashton that he was thinking about the Holocaust and how to allegorize it, and searching for the plastic condition where the compressed forms and spaces themselves expressed my feelings about the Holocaust. In Porch 2, alongside the upright bodies of emaciated children, there are 2 legs sticking upwards, shoes facing the sky. A couple of years later, Gustin was working abstractly, making paintings of short and horizontal vertical strokes. Pretty soon after Gustin returned to making images in the mid-60s, he began to paint shoes, and the motif of upside-down legs came back too. In many of the Marlborough paintings, bodies stuffed into garbage bins stand for the victims of the blood-stained Klansmen. On visits to Italy, especially in 1971, Gustin looked at fragments of ancient sculptures, and massive feet appear in many of the Roma works. Into the 1970s, several paintings were made with bundles of upside-down legs sticking up in clusters behind walls. So upside-down legs, boots, shoes, fragments of feet, these all have a complex history in Gustin's work by 1976. He was perhaps even more drawn to these linked motifs because of his brother's accident in 1932, where following a car accident, his legs turned gangrenous and he died. Traumatized and fascinated by this personal story, Gustin also latched on to Nixon's phlebitis, as we saw earlier, and emphasized this in his great 1975 painting, San Clemente. The 1976 paintings have many origins and connect to half a century of earlier works, and yet it's clear to me that this body of work was Gustin's most explicit confrontation with the memories of the photographs of the death camps, and that the 1976 paintings stand out from all the other occurrences of legs in his work to that date. This is because of the way the legs and shoes were isolated in the 1976 paintings and how they are bent and piled and knotted together. Gustin was reading about Treblinka in 1968, and we know this from his conversation with Morton Feldman. But I doubt he did any new research before embarking on the 1976 paintings, and nor, I think, did he look back at the photographs that he'd seen in 1945 or 46. The photographs, I believe, had burned themselves into his memory, and finally, 30 years after looking at them, he allowed these images to surface and metamorphose in his paintings. I'll turn now to some extremely distressing images. While it's impossible to know precisely which photographs Gustin saw, we can assume that he was aware of the images from Dachau, Buchenwald, and Belsen. Different people would remember different aspects of these photographs. The gesture of the woman walking by, for instance, the appearance of dead faces. I think Gustin could not forget the shapes of the piles, the angles of the limbs, the spherical kneecaps that were so pronounced because the legs were stick-like. As a painter alert to shapes and forms, he must have been struck by the weaving of bodies in the stacks, and by the occasional parts in photographs where the limbs of two separate bodies fall in parallel, one bent knee or outstretched arm echoing another. The recurrent shapes in these photographs were perhaps more important to his memories than the locations or objects that were depicted, but those were unforgettable too. The walls against which inmates were shot, the stacks of shoes, the pits, the ovens. Roberta Smith wrote the first main response to the leg paintings in 1978, and it does not surprise me that she did not mention the way Gustin transformed memories of the photographs of the death camps. Rather than looking at the body pit and flames as historical references, she saw them in a more allegorical or mythical way and read pit as a heavy-handed metaphor for the artist's life as hell. Very few art critics were willing to write about the Holocaust in the 1970s, as no critical or theoretical discourse existed. As a side note, I once studied the reception of Frank Steller's Polish villages that were widely shown in the early 70s. No critic remarked on Steller's allusions to destroyed synagogues, but today, entire exhibitions are devoted to this aspect of the work. Elsewhere, in her article, Smith made the claim that in the 1970s, Gustin was an underground artist, and by this she referred to his isolation in Woodstock and his increasing disconnection from other artists. But even if Gustin had spent his non-painting time prowling around New York's galleries and other artists' studios, he wouldn't have seen very many attempts that paralleled his efforts to confront the memory of the Holocaust. And I want to give some context to his 1976 leg paintings simply to underscore how unusual they were as a body of work. One of the first attempts to engage with the photographs of the camps was the Polish artist Władysław Stromicki's series of collages from 1945 called To My Friends, the Jews. In these little-known works, the artist combined photographs with pencil drawings which seemed to show the outline of bodies. The artist, with Katerina Kobro, was the founder of the Unism movement and had devoted a whole career to exploring questions of shape and anti-composition. It was evident that he could not pursue such inquiries away from a consideration of the impact of the shapes that had emerged in the images of the camps. One of the inmates of the camps, Buchenwald, was the Riga-born artist Boris Lurie, who settled in the United States after the war. A presence in the downtown scene of the 50s and a founder of the tiny movement No Art, his approach to the photographs of the camps was completely different. In 1959, he appropriated one of the famous images showing a cart of corpses, and similarly appropriated a new word circulating in New York to describe sculptural practices, assemblage, and published the photograph with the title, Assemblage by Adolf Hitler. Using the same source photograph, 4 years later, Lurie made his railroad collage, juxtaposing a soft porn image on top of the pile, a complex and at the time totally unrecognized attempt to confront the different registers of photographic images of naked bodies that circulated in the post-war period. As a survivor, Lurie felt a sense of license to use the images of scenes he'd witnessed as he pleased. Another survivor was Alina Shaposhnikov, who at the moment of the early 70s was working in Paris. In contrast to Lurie, she was adamant never to discuss a relationship between her art and her memories of Auschwitz, Belsen, and Theresienstadt. And her sculptures explore the erotics of the female body through a fusion of pop and surrealism. However, in her work Souvenir from 1971, she embedded photographs in resin, one of herself before the war, and surrounding it, 3 repeated photographs of the ghastly face of a dead woman in Belsen. It was as if her own memories of childhood were unrecoverable except through this scenario. Her last group of sculptures were wax body casts that she flattened and separated. These, like some of her human landscape drawings, can be read as returns of imagery of the camps. Gerhard Richter, born a few years after Lurie and Shaposhnikov in Dresden, began to understand that for him, the photographs of the camps could not serve as the subject matter for actual paintings, but rather as the baseline from which a self-reflective German painting practice after Auschwitz could proceed. By 1967, Richter had abandoned his own project to make an exhibition juxtaposing pornographic and death camp imagery, and instead archived material in his atlas, including blurred and hand-colored photographs of camp victims. These works are deliberately offensive and yet operate as questions rather than answers. What would it mean to treat photographs in this way, Richter asks, posing the question, but suspending its answer in his refusal to make the paintings. Today, discussions of artists' responses to the Holocaust routinely include discussions of these works, but the point is that they were not known to Gustin. The first acknowledged American works came a bit after, indeed after he died. For instance, George Siegel's The Holocaust, commissioned for San Francisco and begun only around this time, and Art Spiegelman's Mouse that began to be serialized in 1980. So Gustin's leg paintings were unusual in their explicit engagement with recalled images of body piles. But what also makes them even more distinctive is the way he situated the body piles. They float through the ocean. They rise from an empty landscape. Limbs stack up inside rooms, on wood-floored apartments, and over rugs. A few years before Gustin made these paintings, Martha Rosler worked on her series of collages bringing the war home, using photographs from Life magazine of the Vietnam War and coupling them with images from home decor and interior design magazines. A woman vacuums the curtain while outside a soldiers battle in an offensive. A Giacometti sculpture adorns a residence whose windows open onto fields of bodies. A Vietnamese man holds his wounded baby inside a swanky flat. These works are very well known now, but Gustin would have had no access to them. Rosler's collages and Gustin's 1976 paintings share common ground because both show bodies intruding into domestic spaces. But there's an important difference in terms of intentionality. Gustin deliberately set out to make Rosler deliberately set out to make a series that confronted the way Americans could compartmentalize information. One day reading reports from Vietnam, another looking at interior design magazines. This was a strategic way of addressing the psychic mechanisms that allowed the war to continue. Gustin, I think, was not so intentional. And in allowing body piles to intrude into houses, he was not trying to critically address the way that images of the Holocaust were becoming familiar by making the scenes shocking again. I think he was rather more traditionally describing his own consciousness. Once the images of the camps had been seen, they never went away. The 1966-76 paintings speak to the way that for people of his generation, memories of the camps arose without anticipating them as you went about your daily life. One day, you open the door and there's a pile of bodies falling into your hallway. Let us think a little bit more about what these images of the camps meant to Jews like Gustin, born in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. When he first saw the photographs and films of the camps in 1945, he was in his 30s. The individuals in the body piles were born around the same time as him and were about the same age. Children and old people had been killed in the gas chambers and their bodies burned in mass pits. It was adults who were worked to death that could be found in the piles that were visible at the liberation. Many were from places in Eastern Europe where the Goldstein family had come from. Like so many other American Jews looking at these photographs in the mid-40s, Gustin knew that he would have been on the pile had his parents not made the decision to flee from previous anti-Semitic pogroms. Jews of Gustin's generation acted in many different ways to the photographs, but to schematize, two different approaches were emerging by the time he made his 1976 paintings. One approach was to repress the photographs as much as possible and to put in their place images of Jewish resistance and strength. We see such efforts in some Holocaust memorials. Another approach was to make these images into sacred pictures of Jewish suffering that could not be compared with images of other historical atrocities on account of the fact that the Nazis were attempting to wipe out the Jewish race. This position was the one taken by Elie Wiesel, who was teaching in Boston University in the mid-70s. And as an aside, it would be fascinating to know if the two ever crossed paths, as they were teaching in the same institution. Gustin took a very different stance from these two positions, and it's important to emphasize this. Doré Ashton cites that in late 1973, after the coup in Chile, Gustin wrote to a friend, "Our whole lives, since I can remember, are made up of the most extreme cruelties of holocausts. We are witnesses to the hell. When I think of the victims, it's unbearable. To paint, to write, to teach in the most sincere way is the most intimate affirmation of creative life we possess in these despairing years." The word that I'd like to take out of these sentences is holocausts, plural. Gustin, working just as people were beginning to formulate the idea of the uniqueness and sanctity of the Shoah, looked upon the events unfolding during his life as a series of holocausts, Belsen, Maillet, Chile. These places and events that took place overlaid in his mind. The leg paintings are as much responses to the images he saw in the 60s and 70s as to those he remembered from seeing in the 1940s. There's a very critical point to draw from this today. We're talking at a moment where cultural producers are frequently criticized for representing the historical pain of people from other communities than their own. Of course, there are dangers of sensationalizing and there are limits to empathy. But Gustin's example is worth recalling. Images of Jewish suffering were not to be isolated and sacralized, but remembered and brought back into representation in order to reflect on the suffering of others. Imagery based on one episode of atrocity could help express the despair of another. And I just show in passing Nancy Sparrow, who was also in these years combining imagery of the Holocaust with imagery around her consciousness of the Vietnam War. Yes, but. In his 1968 conversation with Morton Feldman, Gustin talked about people who decided to try and escape from Treblinka. Why escape, he imagines they asked themselves. Why try to escape, since this chance of reaching safety was so small? The only reason, he said, is to bear witness. As he continued to read the book on Treblinka, Gustin said that he began to see life as a vast concentration camp, and he decided that's the only reason to be an artist, to bear witness to this. If we add these words from 1968 to the quote from 1973, we seem to have a very clear account of what Gustin believed painting was for. According to these passages, Gustin's purpose in making art in the 1970s was to confront the extreme cruelties and holocausts of the world and to bear witness. This seems to be an adequate explanation for why he made the 1976 leg paintings. Yes, but, to use the title of a monograph on his work published that very year. Yes, but. Yes, it's true that Gustin felt compelled to bear witness to holocausts, but his production of the paintings was driven by other causes. Each time Gustin prepped a canvas and stayed awake, painting at night, smoking and looking, painting and overpainting, was he wrestling with the responsibilities of what it meant to bear witness, or were other things driving him? Let us recall that he made a lot of paintings of legs. If he felt that he'd made authentic responses to the Holocaust images in 3 or 4 works, what compelled him to complete over 25 huge paintings of legs in 1976? To answer this, we're getting to the heart of the contradictory and confusing impulses that drive artists to make their work. Another reason Gustin made so many works was because he was trying again and again to converse with ghosts, with his beloved Piero and with Goya. We see aspects of these dialogues in the paintings. The whip in Edge, which comes from the flagellation, or the downturned head in Pit, which echoes the body on the pile in the 3rd of May, 1808. Gustin may not have known about how other artists were confronting the Holocaust, but he absolutely knew how painters had depicted suffering and wanted to make the most serious contribution to this tradition. Gustin also made these paintings because he could not stop himself from the endless exploration of shapes and surfaces, of angles and curves, of colors and layers. This is what he did as a painter and what he enjoyed. With each new arrangement of a pile of limbs, bent knees, colored soles, he tried out different forms. He composed with horizontals and verticals. And we're not a million miles away from painting 1954 and the other works of this time. The challenge with each new work was how to make the whole surface and composition feel alive, even if it came out of his memories of looking at death. And crucially, with each new painting, he also let his imagination run off in new directions. It was unpredictable. It must have surprised him. A group of legs could become a multi-limbed organism, like the spiders and bugs that he liked to paint. In some leg paintings, the limbs become a bizarre army with energy and power, an army that could march over the plains or across the waves and perhaps escape their ghastly origins. Let's look at Gustin speaking about monuments for 2 minutes and see what he said. What do I do now? Spacebar. And volume? Okay, let me go back. What do I do with the volume? Just put the volume up.
In other words, you feel as if you're not through until you feel as if you're a medium through which this rhythm is passed through, you know. Otherwise, you can't bear it. It's unbearable. Otherwise, it's wax museum. I was thinking about, not legs. I mean, they're just the excuse. Oh, well, I was thinking about, actually, when it came off, you know, I enjoyed the fact that the top becomes like a top, you know, like a tabletop. You know, a level. And, oh, I really enjoyed myself painting this with the openings, you know, where you open it and where you jam it up. I mean, you're dealing with forces, you know, and suddenly these are charging and this is dangling like a pendulum, you know, and here it's gathering force, like charging out. And, the idea of, yeah, of a completely separate organism, an organism like you find in life, you know, in nature, which has its own energies of diverse energies. And I like the fact that it's happening in front of you rather than, I think in that case, you feel as if you just can't come in on something that's already happened. You know, there's no more, it's already happened. But this is in the midst of happening, which excites me.
It's got nothing to do with feet and shoes.
Nothing at all. I'm glad you said that. I've been hearing enough from people who talk about feet and legs and shoes and, oh.
What the painting is all about, it seems to me, is right here.
You're very,
don't you think?
You're very savvy. You know what really became, that's what Meyer Shapiro, who's a close friend, you know, the art historian.
Yeah.
When he saw his picture, he said, Philip, I said, absolutely, Meyer. Those little openings.
Yes.
Otherwise, you couldn't breathe. Yeah. You'd be unbearable. Yeah. When you said that's it, you bet.
Gustin claims monument has nothing to do with legs and shoes. We need to take this statement seriously, but also understand it as a strategic comment. Gustin did not want to be boxed in and for interpretations to be closed off to readings of images in the works. It was important to emphasize that the painting was an active surface with its own dynamism. It was important to show what his imagination had created. But I'm also sure that if anyone had said that monument had nothing to do with the world, nothing to do with the memory of the camps, he would have objected too. This time last year, the directors of 4 major museums collectively decided not to exhibit Philip Guston's work because of their concerns that his paintings could not be clearly interpreted. One of them went on to clarify this position, saying, "I'm not sure that I would argue that the public needs a white artist to explain racism to them right now. I object strongly to the idea that Gustin is not an appropriate figure to help us think about racism today. He was an artist whose consciousness was formed in an immigrant Jewish community, whose parents fled pogroms, and who lived to witness the Holocaust, and who was appalled throughout his life at the racism affecting other peoples. But I also do not believe that it's art's role to explain, and I do not think his art, or much art of consequence, can ever be clearly interpreted." How do we clearly interpret Guston's 1976 paintings? Are they his way of bearing witness to Holocausts, as he said? Or are they formal, macabre, bizarre, and sometimes comical canvases? How do we reconcile the Gustin who said he really enjoyed painting monuments, and the Gustin who said it was unbearable to think of the victims of his century? What 50-word wall text will clearly interpret the contradictory impulses that gave rise to the making of these works? The director's response to the challenges of presenting Guston's works was to take them off the walls. They were, of course, most concerned with the hoods, but the 1976 paintings could also cause real upsets to anyone today whose parents or grandparents might have survived the camps and who grew up under the shadow of the scenes which the paintings transform. Some viewers might find Gustin's treatment of the images of death camps irreverent, too playful, offensive. Others might have no sympathy with his claim to have enjoyed painting them. For my part, I'm very glad that these works are now on public view and that we can wrestle with all their challenges. We can also think about their connections to contemporary art. There are so many, but since I was working at Tate Modern when the decision about the Gustin show was taken, and since she immediately posted on her Instagram about how much she would have liked to have seen Gustin's exhibition, it has been hard for me not to think about the relationship of Gustin's works and Kara Walker's Fons Americanus. Specifically, I want to point to the related ways that Gustin and Walker approached the imagery and the memory of historical crime. What Gustin did to the photographs of Buchenwald and Dachau seems to me to parallel what Walker does with the Middle Passage and the drownings of enslaved Africans. Walker started her work by thinking about London's Victorian era monuments and the history of the slave trade in the city. She asked herself, quote, "I wondered how to return the gift of having come to be through the mechanics of finance, exploitation, murder, rape, death, ecological destruction, co-option, coercion, love, seafaring feats, bravery, slavery, loss, injustice, excess, cruelty, tenacity, submission, and progress." She asked herself what it meant to create a gift for London. She said, "It took a while before I had the concept, but when it came sort of flooding, let's say, literally flooding out of me, so that it got very large and fluid and funny. As a one-world woman's fair, I've created a space for reflection, joy even, amid the miasma of conflicts, racial, economic, and cultural, which still lodge themselves in our collective gullet." So Kara Walker found aspects of her own work funny and felt that she was creating a space for joy. Within Fons Americanus, there's the most poignant sculpture of a boy drowning in his own tears, and the most absurd image of a girl incongruously wearing a mask and snorkel to escape the sharks that swim around her. There's also a bizarre reference to Kay West. How can these parts be clearly interpreted? Zadie Smith wrote the catalogue for the piece, and her catalogue essay for the piece, and her incredible defense of Walker's right to use her imagination in any way she chose, for me, speaks back to Gustin too. She said, "When it comes to the ruins of history, Walker neither simply represents nor reclaims. Instead, she eroticizes, aestheticizes, fetishizes, and dramatizes, with the consequence that she's accused of an unnecessary or inappropriate cultivation of the grotesque or a prurient interest, salaciousness." Almost done. The second part of Gustin's 1977 show at McKee was very different in tone. It featured paintings of cherries and of Musa's head. This poses a further challenge to interpretation. We're dealing with an artist who could compose with legs one day and with cherries the next. But in any case, after the 1977 show, the legs did not go away because they could not disappear from Gustin's consciousness. That year, Gustin made two paintings called The Coat and one related picture called Back View. All were seen at the time as images of the type of coats that impoverished Jewish immigrants wore, warm for the cold, with plenty of pockets for the schmutters they were selling. We see souls stuffed into the pockets of the coat. The figure in Back View drags his memories with him, all those blood-stained legs. In 1979, a year before he died, Gustin painted Entrance. It's a kind of reprise of The Door that I showed earlier, but even more brutal. It seems that the painting began with a huge pile of limbs. It is festering. The insects are making their way to feed on the legs. To the left, a door was painted over the bodies. but we can still see the shape of knees and thighs in among the brush strokes. The door might be trying to shut so as to conceal the sight that lies before us in the entrance, but it is futile. The pile of legs remain. Thank you.